and welcome to a brand new edition of Global Lens on News 9 Live this Monday evening. I am Neha Khanna. As always, we have a packed show for you with all the top news stories from around the world. Let's get started with our big focus. Israel's Labour Court today ordered an end to a general strike that had crippled the country. A tsunami of angry protests erupted across Israel over the weekend after the Israeli Defense Forces said that 6 of the hostages being held in Gaza were found dead. Businesses, schools and transport across Israel were hit by the strike, with several roads blocked and some flights disrupted. The nationwide strike began after Israel's largest labor union called for the action to push for a hostage deal, saying the entire Israeli economy will shut down. Many government ministries, municipalities, universities, hospitals and schools were impacted by the strike. Even doctors joined in, saying the country is in a very difficult situation because of the hostages still being in Gaza. We can't stand aside. That's why we came to strike. On Sunday, tens of thousands of people took to the streets across Israel after the bodies of 6 hostages were recovered by soldiers from the Gaza Strip, as frustration mounted over the failure of the country's leadership to secure a ceasefire deal that would free Israeli captives. Crowds estimated to be around 500,000 strong demonstrated in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv and other cities, demanding that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu do more to bring home the remaining 101 hostages, about a third of whom Israeli officials estimate have died. Almost 11 months into the Israel-Hamas war, at least 97 hostages still remain unaccounted for. Protesters say Netanyahu has simply not done enough to protect the hostages. 3 of the 6 hostages found dead were expected to be released in a ceasefire deal, according to US and Israeli officials. A cousin of one of the hostages has said all 6 of them were held together and all 6 of them were killed in captivity. We could have saved all of them. They could have come back alive. He added it is the Israeli government's decision to delay that kept the hostages in captivity and cost them their lives. The latest round of protests have added to the mounting pressure on Netanyahu to secure a ceasefire deal with Hamas. In Jerusalem, several dozen people staged a protest right in front of the Prime Minister's residence, holding posters of the 6 killed and other hostages. Prime Minister Netanyahu said on Sunday that Israel would not rest until it catches those responsible for the killing of the hostages whose bodies have been recovered. In a televised statement, Netanyahu said Israel was committed to achieving a deal to release the remaining hostages and ensure Israel's security. He said, whoever murders hostages does not want a deal. Netanyahu met with the families of the hostages. He said the Israeli government and he personally are committed to continue working towards the deal that will bring back all our hostages and guarantee our security and existence, as he put it. He said Israel would continue to pursue Hamas and accused Hamas of not wanting to conduct genuine negotiations. Anger is rising across Israel, at Netanyahu specifically, and reports suggest the Prime Minister is worried about the widespread protests that are sweeping the country. Ahead of the general strike, the Hostages and Missing Families Forum had called for Israel to be brought to a halt, while urging that the country pressurize the government to sign a deal to free the remaining hostages before they were killed as well. The general strike was the largest in Israel since March 2023, when a similar mass walkout over Netanyahu's controversial attempts to overhaul the country's judiciary brought much of the economy to a standstill. In Jerusalem, protesters called for Netanyahu to resign, while during a cabinet meeting on Sunday, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant lambasted the government for what he said was prioritizing control of a key border area known as the Philadelphia Corridor over a deal to free hostages, and he called it a moral disgrace. Splits within the cabinet over the conduct of the war have become increasingly public and rancorous in recent months, reflecting deep divisions at the top of the Israeli government. While efforts have been on for months now to secure a deal that would entail a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all the remaining hostages, with multiple countries led by the United States involved in the negotiations, the latest episode of 6 hostages being found dead has thrown any potential deal into tumult. The US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has said the next few days will be critical. In a virtual meeting, Sullivan told the families of Americans who are being held hostage in Gaza that the Biden administration would work around the clock for a deal to secure the release of the remaining hostages. American officials insist that the deaths of the hostages will not cause the talks to be derailed. But they also acknowledge that these deaths have added a layer of complexity to an already difficult process. Both the Israeli and American governments have scrambled to react since Saturday's discovery of the 6 dead bodies. US officials have voiced frustration previously over resistance on part of Netanyahu in reaching the deal, leading to occasionally tense conversations between President Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister. In fact, just today, President Biden has said that Netanyahu is not doing enough to secure a ceasefire deal. Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris will meet in the Situation Room later today with the US team negotiating a deal, according to the White House. After the bodies were discovered, Biden still expressed hope for a ceasefire agreement, saying negotiators are on the verge of having an agreement and that it's time this war ended. He said, "We think we can close the deal." They've all said they agree on the principles. Recent talks have included senior-level meetings as well as lower-level technical negotiations in both Qatar and Egypt, with CIA Director William Burns attending these discussions. But now, in the aftermath of the discovery of the dead hostages, a potential path forward for a ceasefire agreement remains up in the air. The question is, as anger at home grows over his failure to bring back the remaining hostages, how much longer can Netanyahu dig his heels in, stall a ceasefire deal and continue the war against Hamas in Gaza?
Massive protests swept Israel on Sunday after the death of 6 hostages in Gaza. Protesters are increasingly frustrated over the failure of Israel's leadership to secure a ceasefire deal that would free captives in Gaza, who have now been held for nearly 11 months. Israeli media estimated up to 500,000 people demonstrated across Jerusalem, Tel Aviv and other cities, demanding that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu do more to bring home the remaining 101 hostages, about a third of whom Israeli officials estimate have died. Edith Tepperson blames Netanyahu for what has unfolded.
I think we have a criminal government who lets the hostages be murdered only for the sake of the coalition. And we have a prime minister who doesn't think of the good of a country, but only of his own good.
In Tel Aviv, police officers clashed with demonstrators as they urged them to stop blocking traffic. In Jerusalem, protesters blocked streets and demonstrated outside of Netanyahu's house. It was only earlier the same day that the Israeli military announced the recovery of the hostages' bodies. They say the bodies were found in a tunnel in the southern Gaza city of Rafah, as the Israeli Health Ministry confirmed they were murdered by Hamas terrorists in a number of shots at close range. By the end of Sunday, Labour leaders called for a one-day general strike on Monday. Netanyahu, who faces growing calls to end nearly 11 months of war, said Sunday that Israel would not rest until those responsible were caught, while Hamas officials blamed the Israeli government for the deaths because of its refusal to sign a ceasefire deal. Families of the deceased hostages criticised the government for delays in negotiations, while US President Joe Biden expressed his anger and vowed accountability for Hamas. Negotiations mediated by the US, Qatar and Egypt have not yet succeeded despite ongoing efforts. Meanwhile, Israel and Hamas agreed to pause fighting in areas of Gaza while a polio vaccination campaign begins after a baby last month was partially paralysed by the virus, the first case in the territory in 25 years. Israel's assault on Gaza began after Hamas and other militants killed about 1,200 people and took about 250 hostages in attacks on Israel on October the 7th, according to Israeli tallies. Since then, Israel's offensive has leveled much of the enclave of 2.3 million people, and the Gaza Health Ministry says at least 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. Displaced people are living in dire conditions with inadequate shelter and a hunger crisis.
I'm heading to a national security meeting right now, and then going to Pittsburgh. And so checking on following up on what's happening in Israel, and then I'll be off to Pittsburgh.
Are you planning to present a final hostage deal for the both sides this week?
We're very close to that.
What makes you think that this deal will be successful in a way that the other deals were not?
Hope springs eternal.
Mr. President, do you think it's time for Prime Minister Netanyahu to do more on this issue? Do you think he's doing enough?
No.
Mr. President, what is your reaction to the demonstrations across Israel? What is your reaction to the demonstrations?
I'm going to get the detail when I walk in, and I'll talk to you after that. Okay? Thank you.
Do you have a message for the hostages' family, sir?
Yes, I've spoken to the American hostage. I spoke to his mom and dad, and we're not giving up. We're going to continue to push as hard as we can. Thank you.
President Biden saying Netanyahu is not doing enough to secure a ceasefire and hostage deal with Hamas. What are the implications of this strike and the protests that seem to be gaining momentum across Israel? What does this mean for Netanyahu and for the ongoing war in Gaza? We'll discuss this with our panel of experts after this quick break.
Fast.
My God, isn't she your daughter?
Yes.
She's playing football. This is boys' game. Make her study. If she doesn't get a good job, she will get a good match. Will you win the world by playing football?
Yes, auntie. My daughter will win the world by playing football.
Let's go to Germany.
World's largest football talent hunt. News 9 Indian Tigers and Tigresses. In association with DFB Pokal, Bundesliga, BBB and India Football Center. Train and play matches in Europe. Register now and fly to Germany. IndianTigersandTigresses.com.
This is News 9 Live, India's only digital exclusive live stream. For the early adopters, bringing you the news 24/7. For the smart audiences on the smartest TVs. News 9 Live. Stream now on your smart TVs.
Muktiwani Yoda was aide to Sheikh Mujib came to my show. I told him that the family of Sheikh Mujib under captivity of the Pakistani forces. The first lady came with Sheikh Mujib and she embraced me and said, the God, the Allah has sent you to save us. Modi ji and the Hasina. During talk, she brought out this point again that Major Ashok Tara of Indian Army said me, my mother, my sister, my brother, we got independent on 17th December because of Ashok Tara.
This and more. Streaming on News 9 Plus. News is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News 9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and we're discussing the massive protests that are sweeping across Israel in the aftermath of 6 dead bodies of hostages being found in Gaza. Let me introduce our panelists. Joining me on the show tonight, Lev Aaron, Israeli journalist and columnist, Ambassador Manjul Seth, former Indian diplomat and distinguished fellow at the Forum for Global Studies. And completing the panel tonight is Captain Alok Bansal, director of the India Foundation. A warm welcome to all my guests. Let's begin with our Israeli guest, Lev Aaron. Lev, welcome back to Global Lens. Now, you've seen what's happening across your country over the last 2 days since the discovery of those 6 dead bodies of the hostages. There is a lot of anger across Israel, and most people seem to squarely blame Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for his failure to bring home the remaining hostages safely. 11 months into the war, at least 97 hostages are still unaccounted for, and people are losing patience with this government. Many have even called for Netanyahu's resignation. How do you see these protests that are taking place across your country?
Okay, so I think that we have seen something that we didn't see before. We saw that mostly all the places were closed, including, doctors and other people did not show up to work. A lot of people in Israel, when they say that these hostages were murdered, they do not mean Hamas. They also mean Hamas, but they mean that the policy of Netanyahu murdered these hostages. I don't think we've seen such big hostages since maybe March, long time ago. Okay, we haven't seen that kind of, also the unions, the labor unions, they were part of it. So we hear more and more voices that Netanyahu failed. On the other hand, we also see that the grip of Netanyahu on the right wing becomes stronger when he takes a right-wing stand. And even if we check according to the pollsters, he didn't lose much, or I don't think he lost at all after the cabinet decided that we will not leave the Gazan Egyptian border last Thursday. So on one hand, we see one chunk of the Israelis who hate this government. I don't think any government in Israel was ever hated like this one among this chunk of people, and we are speaking about the elite of Israel. On the other hand, we also have the other Israelis who want a full victory in Gaza, even if it takes more time and whatever it means. So this is like the complicated reply.
And this is a complex situation, Lev, and yes, the stated objective of this war that was declared by Israel at the beginning of the war was the safe return of all the hostages and quote-unquote wiping out Hamas. Many would argue neither of those targets has been achieved 11 months into the war. I'll come back to you, Lev, in just a moment. Let me bring in Captain Alok Bansal at this point. Captain Bansal, the families of the hostages are angry and saying Netanyahu has simply not done enough to bring them back home. Ordinary Israelis are angry and out on the streets. There are many who are saying the Prime Minister needs to go. And then Netanyahu's closest ally, the US President Joe Biden, says Netanyahu is not doing enough to secure a deal. And this isn't the first time that President Biden has shown his impatience with Netanyahu and his intransigent stance. My question is, given how much anger there is at home, even though Netanyahu and his government don't seem to care about international opinion, but given how much anger there is at home specifically towards Netanyahu himself, how much longer do you think the Israeli Prime Minister can dig in his heels, stall a ceasefire agreement and continue this war against Hamas?
See, we need to be very clear that Netanyahu is fighting a political battle for his survival. In fact, the way Hamas carried out the attack, there were a lot of questions raised on the government's ability to defend and the way they behaved actually when there were clear-cut signs that something like this was coming. So there is huge attributability of blame as far as Netanyahu is concerned, and he realizes that he remains in power as long as the war continues. And that is one of the reasons probably I feel that Netanyahu has gone in deliberately for prolonging this war and not trying to strike a deal. And I think the protesters are justified in saying that there were many opportunities when deal could have been struck, but there have been attempts made in such a way that the deal is not struck. So the objectives were in any case made so far-flung. Elimination of Hamas. How do you eliminate an ideology completely? You can probably capture entire Gaza, you can obliterate people, but people outside the territory will remain influenced by Hamas's ideology and they will remain. You can't obviously kill everyone. And there is no doubt that these hostages who were killed they would have probably been exchanged in case a deal would have been struck long back. And I think within the US, President Biden and the Democrat Party are finding a very tough task trying to strike a balance between Israel and the Palestinian demands, because the way the war has been progressing, more and more criticism of Israel is bound to emerge in due course. And I think there is enormous pressure. And I think if Kamala Harris gets elected, you will see more pressure coming onto Israel, the type which was seen during President Obama's presidency. So we will have a problem. I think Bibi Netanyahu still knows that he needs to dig in, because if he leaves the prime ministership, there are possibilities that his crimes may come and catch up with him. So there is a possibility that he might be prosecuted once he's actually no longer in power. So I think he's fighting a battle of survival, and that's where I think he wants to remain in power. But the demonstration that we are seeing now is enormous, and I think Israeli public by and large has seen through that these deaths, while they are attributable to Hamas, they are also to a very large extent attributable to the present Israeli government led by Bibi Netanyahu.
Well, it almost seems as if there is more anger today towards, Netanyahu and his government than even towards Hamas. And I agree with your assessment 100%. Netanyahu seems to be fighting for his own political survival. But how much longer can this go on for? And talking about the scale and the enormity of these protests, the last time such a crippling general strike that practically brought the Israeli economy to a halt took place in that country was in March 2023, when Netanyahu's government was trying to introduce those controversial judicial reforms. This is actually the first time in the course of this war that we've seen this kind of a general strike and protest across Israel, with even clashes taking place in some cases between the demonstrators and the security forces. Okay, let me take this to Ambassador Manju Seth. Ambassador Seth, I think for months now, we've been discussing how Benjamin Netanyahu seems to have a vested interest in prolonging this war for the sake of his own political survival, because he knows his popularity is at an all-time low, and whenever an election is held in Israel next, he could be sent home packing by the people. But on the other hand, Lev makes an interesting point. He says that while the ordinary Israelis may be increasingly angry with Netanyahu, and probably some of them even want him to resign, every time an incident of this nature happens, such as the discovery of the dead bodies of more hostages, Netanyahu's grip on the right wing actually tightens. How do you think Netanyahu plans to play this out?
It's a very tough situation for the Israeli government, for Netanyahu too. And very rightly, as you have put it, it's the right wing which is supporting him right now, will continue to put pressure even during this protests that have been, have been going on today, but started and which were halted, I believe, after a court order. At that time, the right-wing party leaders and others, along with the hostage families and relatives, they held a counter protest, saying that if you step back, telling Netanyahu, if you take any step which does not first get the release of hostages, we will, withdraw support, and we will not allow it. In any case, I've said we will not allow it. So the way that he's in a kind of situation that, he has no leeway left actually right now. And as very rightly mentioned by other panelists, it's a question of survival for him also. But going forward, I think the way things are, the Hamas is also to blame for what is happening, because the way they have killed these 6 hostages, I think there was no need for further killing of any of the hostages, especially when talks are ongoing and there is talk of exchange. And of course, Israel needs to stop, but at the same time, the Hamas leadership understands that by doing this, they are going to create more and more anger, and they will not go to towards a peace negotiation. They know that Israel will back out if there is any, if further hostages are killed or further loss of lives take place. And I think this looks like some kind of deliberate move to keep the war going for whatever their interests are, the Hamas's interests. And of course, for Israel, they do not want to, Netanyahu does not want to be in a position where he has to backtrack from his position of saying that he wants to, occupy all of Gaza and other parts and to eliminate Hamas. And very rightly said, it's an ideology. How do you eliminate all of them? But there has to be pressure brought on the Hamas leadership also to change their way of thinking and the way of approach to the negotiations. Of course, the US is trying very hard, and there have been further, it's reported in the media that they are again trying for a new peace deal and blaming Netanyahu for not doing enough, etc. But I feel both sides have to share the blame in this particular case. Not
okay.
Yeah.
I don't think
of course, needs to
Okay. I don't think anybody in their right mind will absolve Hamas from blame for what has happened starting with the 7th of October last year. It's nothing short of terrorism. But, the reason why there is also so much anger towards Israel now is because you expect better from a civilized democracy compared to a terror organization. Let me go back to our Israeli guest at this point, Lev. You talked about Netanyahu's grip on the right wing, and you talked about how there is so much anger, not just amongst the families of the hostages, but ordinary Israelis with Netanyahu for not doing enough. Biden has said so as well multiple times, including today. The question really is, how much longer do you think Netanyahu can drag this out?
Okay, I will start with Carmel Gat, who was murdered by Hamas. She was a yoga teacher. She came to Israel back from India just 2 or 3 days before the Hamas attack. She was like a real ambassador of India in Israel. So many Israelis are in love with India thanks to her. And she was murdered, and I feel that both India and Israel, we lost a very high soul. I will start with this. I hope she will rest in peace. I think as far as Netanyahu is concerned, anyway, we lost the plot. Because if we ask why people love Israel, admire Israel, and so on, it is because of Munich and Tebe, what we did in Iran. You do something surgical, it starts, it ends, the death toll is very low. Almost you don't see innocent people who are getting killed and so on. So Netanyahu knows that anyway, this war for many Israeli lovers is a total failure because Israel lost the plot. Because the Israeli plot was that you do things quick and very successfully. These are the Netflix films about us. And Netanyahu hopes that if we see Hamas losing, like all the top leaders are getting killed and all the units are dismembered, so at least he will be able to say, yes, I made a big mistake by helping Hamas before 7th of October, and I gave them Qataris money, and I was totally blind to how terrorists they are. But at least once they attacked Israel, they surrendered. And the same way that Nazi Germany and Japan and many other ideas lost their, some people say you cannot kill an idea, yes? But the same way that other ideas in the 20th century lost their political clout, Netanyahu will say the Hamas idea will lose its political clout thanks to my effort, thanks to the fact that I did not give Hamas back. I didn't give Gaza back to Hamas. And yes, we lost a lot of hostages, but at least Hamas will never come back. I think this is the big idea that Netanyahu sells to the right-wing electorate constituency in Israel.
But is that really, is that the reality? Because 11 months into this war, Hamas is still standing strong. Hamas continues to fight the Israeli Defense Forces. Hamas continues to kill hostages, and therefore, is Israel any closer to achieving any of those stated objectives? And you were quite right in saying that the world, the way it sees this war, they believe that Israel has clearly lost the plot. Since you need to leave the show, before I take a break, Lev, I want to ask you this question. Is there anyone who can pressurize Netanyahu into accepting a ceasefire agreement? So far, it has seemed as if even Israel's closest ally, the United States, on which Israel depends greatly to carry on this war, even that country, it seems, has not managed to convince Netanyahu. So if even the US can't and Israelis can't, who can? Who will?
So I think we are in a complicated situation because on one hand, people want a ceasefire. On the other hand, also Americans, Europeans, I guess most of the Indians do not want Hamas to be back in power in Gaza. I think that after what happened on Thursday, that the government decided that they're not leaving the Philadelphia Road, like the de facto border between Egypt and Gaza, people expected Americans to be more harsh on Israel. Biden said a few things, but he said the same. And I think many people in Europe, in America, maybe also people from the left in Israel, expected America to show more will, to tell Netanyahu, we are not, if you keep it, we are not with you. And right now, Americans are not doing it. So right now, there is a huge gap between what Biden says and how Americans behave. And this is because of the simple reason that Americans know that there will be an Israel after Netanyahu.
Okay.
Even if it takes some time. And then Israel is part of the big, let's say, normal, moderate Sunni countries dialogue, eye to you to with India and so on. And Americans want the Israel after Netanyahu to be on the winning side with Hamas and not on the losing side. So the situation is so complicated. On one hand, everybody wants the hostages back. Okay. Everybody wants to end this war because it is endless. Nobody thought it will be like 1 year. And yes. On the other hand, nobody wants Hamas to go out of the tunnels like this.
But, you're making an interesting point there that, the Americans are often accused of doublespeak, and perhaps with good reason, because Biden says one thing, but maybe does quite another. All right, we've had a fascinating discussion, as always, a nuanced analysis from you, Lev, of the situation on the ground. Thanks very much for joining us on the show. I'll request our other two guests to stay on with us. We need to take a quick break here on Global Lens. We'll continue this discussion on the other side.
For the very first time in our investigation, we unmasked the killer of Ravindra Matre.
In 5G, we have to stand with the world, and in 6G, we have to lead the world.
Winning a Grammy was an absolutely surreal experience.
It's said that out of 7 diamonds across the world, 5 are cut and polished in India.
Don't forget, US is the largest consumer of, polished diamonds and the diamond jewelry. And that has taken a big beating for multiple reasons, but largely because of the consumer spending going down on these items. And that's essentially what has hit the diamond industry.
We are at a brim where you see not just one, but multiple very strong global brands coming out of India. And we will make a global mark, and I'm convinced about that.
This and more. Streaming on News 9 Plus. News is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News 9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and we're discussing the protests that are sweeping across Israel after the dead bodies of 6 more hostages were found in Gaza over the weekend. Let me go back to my guest, Captain Alok Bansal. In the earlier segment, we discussed how Netanyahu seems bent on dragging out this war for the sake of his own political survival, and he continues to have a strong grip over the right wing, even as anger amongst ordinary Israelis seems to be growing towards Netanyahu. You know, Lev, our Israeli guest, made a very interesting point. He said that, you know, President Biden may have said on multiple occasions, including today, that Netanyahu is not doing enough. He's being, he's showing resistance. He's being adamant. This war needs to end. But if you look at the actions of the Biden administration, they seem to almost point in the opposite direction. Even Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee and the current vice president who sat down for her first interview as the party nominee the other day, when pinned down on the issue of whether she would be willing to impose an arms embargo on Israel if the need were to arrive, she was completely non-committal, even as she goes on saying that there must be a ceasefire deal. The point really is the United States guilty of doublespeak? Has the US really put enough pressure on Netanyahu?
See, firstly, let there be no doubts that US policymakers find themselves in a bind at this point of time. They are in an election year. The electoral process has started, and there is a very strong Jewish lobby which they cannot antagonize. At the same time, within the Democratic Party, there is a hardcore leftist voters who want that some action must be taken. So as a result, Democrats have to do a tightrope walk. Now, in Republicans' case, they have no such issue. They have no such compunctions. They have no problem. Now you have a Democratic administration. It would not like to antagonize the Jewish lobby at this point of time. They would not like to be seen to be anti-Israel, because that might cost them certain crucial votes. And as a result, they are trying to do a fine balance between the Israel and paying lip service to the Palestinians and their cause. So that is what they are doing. Another issue which I wanted to rake, in fact, I wanted to ask Lev a question before he left. Unfortunately, you did not give me the chance. And this is actually that Hamas spokespersons from Doha have said that the hostages died in Israeli bombing inside the tunnel. Now, obviously, the bodies must have been recovered, and people in Israel would know what actually happened, because looking at a body, you can make out forensically, you can establish what is the cause of death. Now, that is a very important facet, and that I wanted to know, has Israel has some neutral organizations or others made a reason? Is the reason for such a huge demonstration that at least some of the hostages may have died in bombing? So that is one thing which I wanted to know, because that could probably be one of the reasons, and that would be a very, very major issue if they realize that even one hostage died because of the Israeli bombing onto those tunnels.
That is a very important and fair point that you raise. But Captain Bansal, the reality is that since the beginning of this war, what we've seen are claims and counterclaims. This is what happens in the fog of war. It's practically impossible for a third neutral party to really verify claims made by either side. And every time a hostage has been found dead, I can tell you, as somebody who's followed this story very closely, Hamas has claimed that the hostages were killed in Israeli fire, and Israel has claimed that they were killed by Hamas. So these claims and counterclaims have gone on since the beginning of this war, and I don't know if we will ever know the entire truth. So while you make a fair point, I don't think anybody at this point in time is really in a position to corroborate one claim or the other. Let me take this to Ambassador Manju Seth at this point. Ambassador Seth, the question simply is, what is the way forward? There are some who believe that the, killing of these 6 hostages, we still don't know how they died, could embolden the right wing and make Netanyahu take an even more hawkish stance? And then there are those who might say that, well, now you will have more pressure coming in from Washington. The United States will probably now act with a greater sense of urgency because it is that country which is leading the negotiations for a ceasefire deal with Qatar and Egypt. How do you see things panning out?
As you very rightly said, the negotiation and proposals for negotiations, draft proposals are being discussed and being led by the US. But I still feel that is everybody on board? And it doesn't look like, because each time the discussions have taken place in the last few times, which I've been reading about, the Israeli side puts some demands and agrees to most of it, but then as soon as the Hamasis, they put their own demands and they blame each other. And this has been going on for some time, and saying that we are not putting any demands, the other side is. And I think the new chief of Hamas probably has a vested interest in ensuring that the peace deal doesn't come through, because it gives him a kind of upper hand in the current scenario, where all the sympathies, world sympathies, and even people, as we've seen within Israel, going anti-Netanyahu. And so they're all, I think, games are being played, and he's trying to, Hamas is trying to put pressure on the US as well, and on Netanyahu also, to agree to his terms and conditions. And on the other hand, Netanyahu wants the peace deal to be on his terms and conditions. So the way things are, I feel there's very little chance of an early breakthrough, or an early end to this war, the way things are at the moment. Eventually, of course, I still feel firmly that only a two-nation situation solution is the problem. I mean, to the problem, a two-nation solution is the only solution. But that, again, Israel has not been very supportive of that. Many in Israel, some in Israel are supportive, but I think the Netanyahu government has not been very sort of supportive of it. So we don't know how things are going to go further. But from what I can make out, while there is a great urgency for this to end, I don't seem too much, I'm not too optimistic of an early end to this war.
You're quite right. Given the deeply entrenched positions and the intransitions on both sides, it doesn't look like we're going to see the war come to an end anytime soon. It's another matter that next month we're going to mark the first anniversary of this war. Who could have thought this war would drag out for so long? And at stake are the lives of not just the Israeli hostages, but remember also the Palestinians, the civilians who are dying every day in Gaza. On that note, Ambassador Manju Seth and Captain Alok Bansal, thank you so much for joining me on the show. All right, from the Israel-Hamas war, let's now turn our attention to the Russia-Ukraine war. At least 47 people, including 5 children, were injured on Sunday after Russian missiles struck a shopping mall and events complex in Ukraine's northeastern city of Kharkiv. Earlier in the day, Russia said Kiev had launched one of the biggest drone attacks against it since the war began, targeting power plants and an oil refinery. This even as Russian forces have made further gains towards a key town in eastern Ukraine.
Rescuers helped this man on Sunday in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, who, despite surviving a missile attack on an events hall, insists he's fine. More than 10 missiles were fired at a number of locations in Kharkiv, according to the regional governor. This video from social media appears to show one of those strikes. Officials said dozens of people were hurt, including children. Near the same hall, a paramedic applies a tourniquet to this man before he's rushed to an ambulance. As flames rise from a shopping mall, some, like Valentina Novosel, sought shelter underground in a metro station. I was at work when there was an explosion, she says. The attack on the northeastern city prompted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to renew calls on allies to allow Kyiv to fire Western-supplied missiles deeper into enemy territory and reduce the military threat posed by Russia. Meanwhile, in Russia, a social media video appeared to show a drone hitting this Moscow oil refinery, as well as smoke coming from this power station in the neighboring region. Moscow said Kyiv launched one of the biggest drone attacks since the full-scale war began, targeting power plants and an oil refinery. It also said its forces made further advances towards a key town in eastern Ukraine. Earlier, Russian officials said air defense units had destroyed scores of the drones, and that it was debris that caused the fires. Kyiv has yet to comment on the drone barrage. Russia rarely discloses the full extent of damage inflicted by Ukraine's air attacks. Ukrainian forces also shelled Russia's southern Belgorod region on Sunday, injuring multiple people according to the regional governor. All of the fighting comes at a crucial juncture in the 2.5-year conflict. Russia is pressing an offensive in eastern Ukraine while trying to expel Russian forces that broke through its western border in a surprise incursion last month. Last week, Russia pounded Ukraine with the heaviest airstrikes of the war, hitting targets including energy facilities. Moscow says damaging Ukraine's energy system is a legitimate military goal. For its part, Ukraine has stepped up its own attacks on Russian infrastructure. While Moscow denies targeting civilians, its drone and missile barrages have killed thousands of them since the conflict began in February 2022.
For the first time since World War II, a German far-right party is projected to win in regional elections. Founded in 2013, Far-Right Alternative for Germany, or AfD, is on track to claim victory in state parliamentary elections in the country's eastern region of Thuringia, according to exit polls. AfD is projected to get 33.5% of the vote, well ahead of the Conservative Party, the Christian Democrats, with 24.5%. Such a result would hand unprecedented power to AfD, even as other parties try and exclude it from office.
Projections showed the Alternative for Germany was on track on Sunday to become the first far-right party to win a regional election in Germany since World War II. That hands the AfD unprecedented power, even if other parties are sure to exclude it from office. The party was set to win 33.2% of the vote in the state of Thuringia, according to projections from broadcaster ZDF, which could potentially allow the AfD to block decisions requiring a 2/3 majority, such as the appointment of judges. Celebrations were not open to the media, but were broadcast on the party's YouTube channel. I think the mood is very clear. People want change, said Bjorn Höcke, who leads the AfD in the state. He's the party's most extreme and controversial figure. He was fined this year for using a banned Nazi paramilitary slogan. Thuringia Premier Bodo Ramelo's party was battered, despite his own personal popularity. He said all democratic parties now had to work together.
Ich kämpfe gegen die Normalisierung des Faschismus.
I am fighting against the normalization of fascism, he said. In neighboring Saxony, conservatives have run the state since 1990. Projections put them just 1.1 percentage points ahead of the AfD. The AfD, known for their anti-immigration stances, may have drawn momentum in the final week of the election from a deadly knife attack at a festival. It was allegedly carried out by an illegally resident Syrian national that authorities had failed to deport. With a year to go before a national election in Europe's largest economy, the results appeared punishing for Social Democrat Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition. All three parties in the federal government look to have lost votes in both states, according to the projections. The results could increase pressure on Scholz to be tougher on immigration and intensify the debate over support for Ukraine, as they were issues that dominated campaigning.
All right, let's now get you the latest on the investigation into the helicopter crash that killed the Iranian president a few months ago. An official investigation into the helicopter crash in May this year that killed Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi and 7 other people has found that the crash was caused by challenging climatic and atmospheric conditions. That's what Iranian state TV has reported. The final report of the Supreme Board of the General Staff of the Armed Forces says the main cause of the helicopter crash was the complex climatic conditions of the region in spring. The report also cites the sudden appearance of a thick mass of dense fog rising upwards as the helicopter collided with the mountain. According to the report, there were no signs of sabotage. Raisi died alongside 7 others, including his foreign minister, in the crash in a remote mountainous area in
Helicopter crash
northwestern
along with Foreign
Iran.
Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian and others.
All right, in other news, China has claimed that the Philippine Coast Guard vessel, which has been illegally anchored at the Xianbin Reef in the South China Sea since April this year, started moving on Saturday morning but deliberately and dangerously rammed a Chinese Coast Guard ship. In a statement, the Chinese Coast Guard has said the Philippine Coast Guard vessel in question began to move and continued maneuvering provocatively within the lagoon of the reef.
The Philippines and China on Saturday accused each other of intentionally ramming Coast Guard ships in disputed waters of the South China Sea. The collision near the Sabina Shoal was their 5th maritime confrontation in a month. Beijing claims almost the entire South China Sea, including parts claimed by the Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Taiwan and Vietnam. The Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016 found China's sweeping claims had no legal basis, a ruling Beijing rejects. Portions of the waterway, where $3 trillion worth of trade passes annually, are believed to be rich in oil and natural gas deposits as well as fish stocks. The Philippine Coast Guard said that the China Coast Guard vessel 5205, quote, directly and intentionally rammed the Philippine vessel without provocation. They added that the ramming damaged the Philippines' 320-foot ship, but no one was injured. In a statement, a China's Coast Guard spokesman said a Philippine ship, quote, illegally stranded at the shoal, had lifted anchor and, quote, deliberately rammed a Chinese vessel. He called on the Philippines to withdraw immediately or bear the consequences.
With that, it's a wrap on Global Lens. Thanks so much for watching. Do join us again at the same time tomorrow.
How do you fulfill that promise? Because ultimately expectations have to be met. If you look at the political landscape, is it really changing for women? And what is the inability of the forces that dead bodies surface but not the living people?
Four devastating attacks within just 20 hours that left 130 people dead. 2024 has seen a major escalation in violence in Pakistan's Balochistan province. On August the 25th,